Psalm 19 and verse 14. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Eternal, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Good evening. Chag Sameach, happy festival. We are now ending the third day and beginning the fourth day of this 7-day festival. So we're at the middle of the festival. And you may remember what happened in the middle of the festival when Jesus Christ is recorded as keeping it in John, the 7th chapter. I'll turn there to begin. John 7 and verse 14. It says, now about the middle of the feast, and we're there. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. Well, we have no temple to go to, but here I am teaching. I'm following his example, and I'm teaching in the middle of the feast. And some of you will be getting this message this evening after we upload it. Some of you will be getting it later on in the feast, or maybe even after you get home. But it'll be available to you. It's a very important subject I want to cover today. I've covered it in the past, but I felt like I was beginning to let down in this area, and so if it's bothering me, it may be bothering some of you too. And that is the subject of Christian communication. Christian communication. I taught my children that the ability to speak another language or several languages is really valuable. But the ability to keep your mouth shut in one language is really, really valuable. We have to be careful and control when we speak. However, sooner or later, we do have to communicate. But when we communicate, are we doing so as Christians? Because there's a tremendous power in what we say. Words have a tremendous impact. People want to say, you know, the famous saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But we know that actually that's fortunately not the case. I want to go through some scriptures in the Old Testament and in the New about this subject of Christian communication. And I want to begin in the book of Proverbs. But actually, I want to begin in the book of Psalms in the 34th. This is a very interesting psalm. It's what you call acrostic. It's alphabetically organized. It's organized according to the Hebrew alphabet. You have 22 verses here. You could have 21 because the fifth and sixth letter are combined in one of the verses. However, you still have 22 verses because there's an extra one tacked on. So the first 21 verses are in the order of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, etc. And then finally there's an extra verse, verse 22 at the end. So this psalm is called acrostic. It's alphabetically organized. It's a very powerful psalm, and it was the inspiration of a book that was written in the last century that made a very, well, actually towards the end of the 19th century, that made a very important impact. And it was a book about bad language, about slander. And the author of the book was warning his followers to be very careful in their speech, not to slander, not to use a speech in a malicious way. And the basis of the book was Psalm 34. And so I'm going to go there and quote these verses. This is verse 12 of Psalm 34. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. This is so common in our culture where people tear down other people, backbite verbally, or even lie. So common. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. And then it goes on to say, depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. You've got to be careful in your speaking that you're seeking peace in your speaking. You know, arguments, it takes two to make an argument. If one person is getting very argumentative, the other one can tamp it down depending on how that person responds. This person who wrote this book was a very famous rabbi, Israel Meir Kagan, Israel Meir HaKohen. So he was of the priestly line, so he was a distant relative. He was in northeastern Europe when he wrote this book, and he based it on the verse 12. Who is the man who desires life? And in Hebrew is Mi ha'ish hachafetz chayim. Who is the man who desires life? So he called the book Chafetz Chaim, desiring life. And so he became known by that name. In history, he's known as the Chafetz Chaim. If you want to Google him, he's known as the Chafetz Chaim, this particular rabbi. He was perhaps the greatest rabbi of his time, the Chafetz Chaim, and he's known because he wrote that book warning his people against being malicious. And there's a very famous story that I told my children about him. And as I said, he was living in northeastern Europe. He died in 1933. He died at the age of 94 or so, before the Holocaust. Anyway, he tells a story or there's a story told about him that's very interesting. He went underground. He dressed up as if he were just a typical. Okay, somebody here wants a riding implement. I have one. Okay, fine, good. So now you know, those of you who are watching this, that there are people listening in the room as well. I have a live audience here. So anyway, he was in northeastern Europe. He was already very famous. He had a very great reputation. And as I said, my children know this story. He had a very good reputation. So he tried to dress up as just maybe a person who drove a wagon, or was a fisherman or something, for a living. He didn't dress like a rabbi, and he was not a very impressive person. He was very short, and he wasn't necessarily just charismatic in his appearance. So he went into town, and there was a man who was very excited. He said, "Wow, the Chafetz Chaim is coming to visit our town." And so the Chafetz Chaim was disguised, and so he said, he's not so great, the Chafetz Chaim. It's a big deal. And the guy got very angry, and he punched him. All right. So anyway, later on, the Chafetz Chaim comes to town, dressed up as he normally would look, and this guy comes out and looks at him. "Oh no!" And he faints dead away. I beat up on the Chafetz Chaim, and he faints dead away. And so the moral of the story is, don't slander even yourself, let alone anybody else. Don't slander anybody else. Don't even slander yourself. But anyway, this scripture is such a powerful one that it's quoted by the Apostle Peter. And I want to go to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, where he quotes this verse. I'm going to go into the 9th verse of 1 Peter 3. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling. There used to be these famous beach movies in the 60s, Annette and Frank, that they were famous, and they would have an argument, a lover's quarrel, and people would line up on either side, and when Annette made a point, that, I guess the girls would go, "Yeah, yeah," and when Frankie made a point, the boys would go, "Yeah, yeah." Well, see, the idea is that life is not a game that where you're scored so many points. You could win an argument and destroy a relationship. It's more important to lose an argument maybe, but not to destroy a relationship. You don't have to sort of see how many points am I making versus the other person. And I know that because I was a varsity debater. Some people have maybe, they're famous football players or baseball players. I was a famous debater, or I don't know how famous I was, but at least I was a varsity debater. And that's not the way of life I chose later. I didn't choose that way of life of just seeing how well I could argue and how many points I could score against the other person. That was my personality as a teenager, but it's not the personality I chose as I got older. Anyway, verse 9, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. So we were called to be positive in our speech. We weren't called to put other people down verbally. For he who would love life, he quotes this same passage. He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. And there are many verses in the Old Testament about being careful about what we say. Being careful about what we say. So there's a few I want to turn to. Here's Proverbs 12 and verse 18. Proverbs 12 and verse 18. There is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword. We all know people like that, I suppose. We don't want to be that way, I hope. But the tongue of the wise promotes health. In other words, if you're righteous in the way you speak, you're going to actually help people to be healthier, even emotionally, even physically. We can get people probably sick even physically if we're continually harassing them verbally because it upsets them emotionally. That's going to affect their physical condition. On the other hand, if we're supportive verbally, we can actually help them not only emotionally but even their physical health. I want to go on now to verse 25. Anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. You know, sometimes a person is kind of down, and you can say just the right thing to pick that person up. We have somebody in the room here who's very good at that, by the way. One of our people listening to me now, Rosalind, she is, that's one of her personality traits. She has that gift of lifting people up by her comments. So it's nice to have her in the room for this talk. I'd like to go now to Proverbs 16 and verse 24. Proverbs 16 and verse 24. Well, let's first go to Proverbs 15 and verse 1. And that's a point I made earlier. Proverbs 15 and verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So you can put fuel on the fire and make it more intense, or you can tamp it down. You know, a soft answer turns away wrath. You know, sometimes a person can make a comment, and then if you answer properly, calmly, coolly, warmly, it may end the battle right there. On the other hand, if you answer back, or if you speak roughly to a person, it could stir up a whole long argument, and it might even get physical after a while. All right, let's go to Proverbs 16 and verse 24. By the way, I live in a city which does have, unfortunately, not necessarily right where I live, but there are parts of the city where I live, even though it's a tourist attraction, and this is supposed to be the happiest place on earth. But the people who live here, there is a lot of crime, and a lot of times it starts with arguments that then get out of control and get violent. I hear news about that almost every day. Living here. So I don't want to discourage you from visiting Central Florida. Come on down. We depend upon the tourist trade. But when you come on down, don't get into arguments. Try not to get into arguments is the thing. Okay, Proverbs 16, verse 24. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. So what you say can make a difference. It really can make a difference. I'd like to go to Proverbs 18 and verse 21. And all of us really understand this. We can steel ourselves, and we should, where remarks don't hurt us. Obviously, if we can be strong and deal with negative remarks and, let them kind of roll, what's the expression, like water off a duck's back. Obviously, it will be better if we can toughen ourselves and be that way. But it isn't easy. Words can sting. Proverbs 18 and verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. So if we know how to use our tongue, it's a great blessing. Those who know how to speak, it's just a tremendous benefit to them. I want to conclude now Proverbs by going to the 25th chapter and the 11th verse. A word fitly spoken, Proverbs 25:11, is like apples of gold in settings of silver. It's if you just know how to say the right thing. There are certain statements that just ring over the centuries. There are quotations all of us know because they were just so well put, and that they had a very big impact, and people still recite them and learn them, memorize them, and repeat them. So now I want to go into the New Testament, and very powerful instruction here in Mark, the 5th chapter. We're told not to murder, but you don't want to murder verbally either. You don't want to incite hatred. You don't want to have an attitude of hatred, because if you have that attitude of hatred, then you maybe haven't committed the act, but you almost, at least mentally, you may have committed the act. So in Matthew 5 and verse 22, well, I'll go to verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. That's the commandment, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Obviously, you don't murder. But on the other hand, or more so, try to prevent yourself from getting into a bitter frame of mind towards somebody else. Try to prevent yourself from getting into the attitude that would be the first step towards murder. as it says. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. So, there may be times, to be properly angry. There's a scripture, for example, where Jesus calls one of the Herods, that fox. So I don't think he meant that as a compliment. He was describing a ruler who was clever, but a fox is a villainous animal to most people. It attacks the hen house. And more than that, in the book of Matthew, Matthew 23, look what he says to the Pharisees. I'll turn there. So there is a time to be righteously indignant, and look what he says to the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and verse 33. Of course, that's Jesus Christ speaking. So he has the right to be righteously indignant, but he called them serpents, brood of vipers. How can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna? They were, obviously they deserved it, and he gave it to them. But remember this: when he did so, he knew he was signing his death warrant. But that's what he came to do. But he knew he was going to be martyred for those words. So even if you feel like the time has come for you to quote unquote speak truth to power, understand there's implications to that. Are you willing to take them? Anyway, let's go back to Matthew 5. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his friend Raka, empty, you're not worth anything, or maybe you're empty-headed, you're a worthless person, shall be in danger of the council. So you don't go around insulting people. It's not something that Christians should do. They shouldn't be insulting other people, demeaning them. But whoever says you fool shall be in danger of hellfire. That's a very strong condemnation. So you have to be very careful how you talk to other people. Now, as I said, there are times when Paul spoke that way and Jesus spoke that way. There's a time and a place, but we have to be careful. We have to be wise in these matters, and we're warned about controlling how we speak to other people, how we address them. So I want to go, keeping that in mind, I want to go to the book of James, because he has a whole section on that I'd like to go into in this subject of Christian communication. I want to go to James, the 3rd chapter. And again, in James, he brings out the power that there is in speaking, the power of the tongue. It's interesting, on the Day of Atonement, if you were to go to a synagogue, they have these confessionals that they recite. And as they recite the confessional, they pound their chest, where their heart is, I guess they pound their chest towards the left side where assumedly the heart is. And, this sin and that sin and this sin and that sin. And there's a confessional. And it's interesting how many of them are sins of the tongue, slandering, lying. And a lot of the sins that they talk about are what they commit in terms of speaking. If you look at the confessional in a typical high holiday prayer book, it's interesting. Anyway, I want to go to James 3, and this, of course, is one that's very scary for me to read, but it's there. It's in the book. It says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." There are some people who maybe lust after that kind of an office, but be careful, what you wish for. Anyway, "For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." So if you can control your speech, that's a major character strength, "Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body." So he has that analogy there, that just as what you say, can affect your whole being. When you hit a little bit in a horse, we can control which direction the horse goes. By the way, I talked about this the other day. Yesterday I was talking about Simeon the righteous, also called Simon the just, this high priest, and how he talked about the very important principles of life, and how Jesus Christ elaborated on that in a way in the Sermon on the Mount, some of which I just read. I want to go back to other instruction that Jesus gave. If we read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, if we go further, we go to Matthew 12. And I want to go to other instruction that Jesus gave, relating, in effect, back to Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and Matthew 12 and verse 34. Because it goes to the principle I covered the other day, that in the computer world they say GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you fill your mind with swill, then swill's going to come out of you in terms of what you talk about and what you say. And it says in Matthew 12:34, again, criticizing the religious leaders of his day, he says, "Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So you have to be careful what kind of attitude you have, because that's going to affect what you say. Sooner or later, you'll blurt out things. Now, sometimes you blurt out things and you really don't mean them. That's understandable as well. But over time, if you harbor bad attitudes, it will be reflected in maybe either in your tone of voice or what you say, how you say it. You know, you can't. It's very hard to suppress bad feelings if they're there. So it's better to work with them and overcome them so they don't then affect what you say. Because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Okay, I want to go now back to James 3. And we talked about bits in horses' mouths. Verse 4. Look also at ships. He gives another example. The rudder on a ship, how the big, powerful ship is controlled by the small rudder. And you can make it go one direction or another. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. So the pilot can be there on the rudder and can turn the ship around the way the ship is constructed. So that shows how the tongue can direct one's life. You know, by how we use our tongue, the whole body is affected. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. You know, you can say the wrong thing, and then maybe there's somebody has a grudge against you for a long, long time because you said something really hurtful, you know, really negative to that person. It may be a long time till that person can recover. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell, you know, the Gehenna. So the tongue can be a very negative thing, as we know, unfortunately. People can be very malicious, can say very bad things, and people can be accused of things that they haven't done. Sometimes comments are made, ethnic slurs. People are attacked for their religion or for their race, or you know, that sort of thing. Some of us have experienced that personally. You know, we've been called names just because of the particular ethnic group we belong to, or the particular religion we practice. We've had people attacking us verbally. And he goes on to say, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. So even at the time of James, you know, people were known for having trained animals, and certainly in our own time we've seen that. You know, we've seen elephants and lions and tigers and bears and dolphins and, you know, killer whales, and on it goes. We've seen these animals tamed and trained, and but look what it says in verse 8. But no man can tame the tongue. So even though we can control these animals, we can't control how we speak. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Now he's giving, you know, the negative side here. Obviously, if you put all the scriptures together, there's obviously very positive as well. But what he's showing is the dangerous aspect of it, because he wants us to be very careful about it. And so he's focusing on that in this particular passage. And he does show the positive side here. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men. So as often we understand, if we say we love God, we need to love our fellow human beings created in God's image. So if we say we love God, we also should love other people. So we shouldn't be coming to church and praising God and then talking down other people. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. So something's wrong with us if we're that way. If we're constantly talking down to people, demeaning people, insulting people, let's say causing strife in what we say, there's something wrong with us internally. We've got to step back and get a handle on ourselves. As he says, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? That doesn't happen. Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? It doesn't work that way in nature. Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So what he's saying here is that, we've got to get ourselves under control where whatever we say is positive overall. As I said, there's a time for righteous indignation, but that's what it should be, righteous indignation. It shouldn't be malice because of some selfish attitude on our part. And he said earlier, or Jesus said earlier in Matthew 12, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if our heart is right, overall what we say will be appropriate to the occasion. I want to go to a letter now that Paul wrote. This is a writing of James, a letter that he wrote. I want to go now to something that Paul wrote in Colossians. In the book of Colossians, the 4th chapter, verse 7. And this is a summary, in effect, of what I'm talking about today. Today I gave a brief talk, but hopefully it's food for thought that we can, look at these verses and similar ones, and it's a subject to work on. And as I said, I found myself slipping into, let's say, what's the right word? I found myself wanting to take back maybe certain comments I'd made or certain things I'd said, and so if I'm dealing with that issue, then maybe some of you are, so we can all help each other in overcoming that particular problem. And in Colossians 4, and am I in Colossians? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, it's verse 6. Colossians 4 and verse 6. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt. Remember, we're the salt to the earth. We're the preserver of the earth. God is going to save the world from self-destruction because he's got a church here. And the church, in effect, is preserving the world as salt preserves. Also, salt enhances the flavor of food. And so the fact that there's a church here enhances the world, makes the world, in effect, more flavorful. So, and what does Jesus say? If the salt loses its savor, it's useless. So we've got to be the salt of the earth, and our speech should reflect that. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So realize people are different. Maybe a very intellectual person should be answered on that level if we can. A person less so, could be, answered less so. A child, you may speak to a child. I don't mean you should talk baby talk like some people do, but I mean, to a child, you don't speak the same way as you speak to an adult. If somebody is not as fluent in English, you slow down, you're more careful how you speak because they're not understanding you as well. So you're more gentle the way you speak to them than somebody who's a native speaker of English, for example, or whatever the language is. If you're speaking your native language and to a native speaker, you're going to speak differently than to somebody for whom it's his or her second language, because you realize that they're having to concentrate harder to understand you. So slow down a little bit, and be considerate. So overall, and also you speak differently to somebody who's a fellow member of the church than somebody who's on the outside who doesn't have the same understanding. And not that you're shifty or what's the right or sinister or anything like that. you treat them as, we're the insiders, they're the outsiders, we're special, they're not like that. But just realize that not everybody has the same beliefs and practices that you do. So you may word something differently to somebody who's not in your faith. You may word something a little differently so as not to cause offense, or so as not to cause confusion. So let me just read that verse again. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So that's something that we can think about, pray about, and work on over the course of the days and weeks and months and years ahead, and also during this festival season when we're interacting with other people in places where we're visiting as tourists, or also those who are keeping the feast with us, family and friends that are keeping the feast with us. We can try to put these principles into practice. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So this is a basic introduction and food for thought on this very important subject of Christian communication. So we hope that this message has been of value to those of you who have been listening or who will listen later. All the best to you and yours.